Welcome to Drama-Free Healthy Living with Jess Cording. I'm your host, Jess Cording. I'm a registered dietitian, health coach, and author, and I'm here to help you streamline your wellness routine and establish a sane, more balanced relationship with food and fitness so you can reach your goals without losing your mind. On this podcast, we'll talk about nutrition, exercise, self-care, mindset, and more. I'll be bringing you interviews and expert insight on the topics that matter to your health and wellness. Hi, and welcome back to the Drama-Free Healthy Living podcast. I'm your host, Jess Cording. And today I have you guys know I'm allergic to small talk, and this episode is on the topic of trauma healing, which is something you know is near and dear to my heart. I am chatting with Karena Kilcoyne, who is a former trial lawyer who specialized in criminal defense, including complex white-collar and civil litigation in federal and state courts. Later in her practice, she worked as in-house counsel for a publicity-traded worldwide manufacturing company. Today, she talks with us about her own traumatic experiences that really shaped her life and what it was like to acknowledge that trauma and take steps to heal it. Today she is more of a wellness expert and a writer and passionately shares her own personal story of trauma and healing. So she teaches others how to rise above their own stories. We talk a lot today about the role of the stories that we tell about ourselves and, really how to find true peace and emotional freedom. So, in videos and personal posts on Facebook and Instagram, and also in her new book called Rise Above the Story, she shares about her own experience and just a wealth of useful tools to help you along the healing journey. So I really hope that you enjoy today's episode. If I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. So, feel free to connect with me on Instagram at Jess Cording, or you can visit my website, jessicacordingnutrition.com for more info and you can catch other episodes as well. We're the Drama-Free Healthy Living podcast on all the places where you download podcasts and YouTube now. So yeah, I hope you love today's episode and let's get to it. Karina, welcome to the podcast. It's so nice to have you here.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Jess. It's such a treat to be with you.
So I know, we have a lot of, I so appreciate, your willingness to be vulnerable and share your story and just to use what you've learned throughout your work and your life to help other people. It's just so incredible. And, as I was sharing in my introduction about you worked as a criminal defense attorney, which is just, wow. I would love to hear your thoughts about just, what that taught you about the power of how we tell our own stories.
Yeah, it was such a great question because I did spend my early career as a criminal defense attorney before I shifted into writing mode. And over my career, it evolved into different types of cases. So early on, I worked as a court-appointed lawyer. So I would do everything from, traffic stops to drug possession. I had some great mentors that, allowed me to help them with murder cases and death penalty case and, court of appeals cases. And then I evolved and moved into more white-collar criminal defense. So more financial fraud and accounting and taxes and things like that. So what I found so interesting is that in my career as a criminal defense attorney, that was the first time that I really caught on about this idea about stories and the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we live under and how they shape our lives. So just, as a lawyer, it's just seeing early on in my career, all these people who would kind of go through the revolving door of the criminal justice system, and I would represent them once and then they'd come back for something else. And, and in those early days, you'd see things about, their own abandonment, the way they grew up, the poverty they grew up in, what they believed about themselves or how they didn't have real friends or family. So they would get involved in gangs. And so I would see it there. But what was really interesting was that even as my career evolved and I got more into white collar crime, you could also see the stories play out there. There are so many of us, that me included, that chase success or chase this kind of like external validation. And it's just, again, so interesting to me to see that whole, how that story idea plays out, regardless of who you are, your social status, your economic status, whatever it is, these kinds of stories and trauma affect us all, really.
Oh my goodness, I could not agree more. And I was brought up. My mother is a psychotherapist, but also found her way there initially by becoming a hypnotherapist when I was, I don't know, 10 or so. And so I grew up as a teenager being taught about the law of attraction and that your thoughts shape your reality and what you put out dictates what you get back in. It kind of was drilled into me to be very aware of how I'm communicating my own story to myself and others, and probably more than I need to be. But I catch myself all the time if I'm thinking about an experience I'm having or talking about an experience and kind of being very aware of like what that is actually communicating. It's sometimes I wish I could turn it off. But well, maybe I don't really wish I could turn it off, but there are times when I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, we got to look at this a little closer. But um, I something I just really appreciate about your work is that so in your new book, for example, Rise Above the Story, you draw from life lessons, brain science, proven techniques, and you share these simple tools that help shift our mindset and help us triumph over our trauma, which is just wow. I mean, when you consider the fact that 70% of US adults are estimated to experience some type of traumatic event in their life,
Mhm.
how are some of the ways that this trauma can show up for people and just in their day-to-day life, the effects that it may have?
Oh, it's really so fascinating to me how, in how many ways it can show up. So let's just back up for a second and just talk about suppressed trauma and like what is that and the emotions around it. So my book is all about this idea, and I wrote it after my own healing journey that I went on for mental and emotional help. So, this idea about we go through trauma, and when we don't process what happens to us, when we don't deal with the emotional energy we have surrounding it, and instead we suppress it and we compartmentalize it and we think, oh, I'll ignore it and it will go away. Right. I'm sure we could talk about this for a long time with your
Ah,
experience, but emotions are energy. And so they don't go away. They just, if you stuff them down, that's where they stay. So what I write about and what I talk about is this idea of suppressed emotional energy. So when you experience trauma and you don't deal with the emotion surrounding it, it stays in your body and it creates these stories for you. Your brain creates stories around your trauma because your brain wants to keep you safe. Your brain shifts into survival mode. So when you have this when you have this suppressed, unprocessed emotional energy, your brain may still think you're in some kind of danger. So it writes these limiting stories for you about your shame and your unworthiness and who you can't be in the world and what you shouldn't do. So what does that look like how does that play out in day-to-day life? Well, I'll just use myself for an example. Professionally, I went out into the world chasing success, thinking that if I had won the big case, if I had all the right clients, that I would somehow heal myself from all this shame and trauma I had experienced. Well, that didn't work. And so what it was leading me to was driving myself with perfectionism and this overdone type A personality stuff where I just couldn't ever do enough and everything had to be a certain way. And so I was driving myself with all this perfectionism and fear instead of compassion and love. And personally, all this suppressed trauma affects us so powerfully in our day to day life, in our friendships. Are we needy? Are we clingy? Do we think the worst? Do we not trust people in our platonic relationships and even our romantic relationships? We marry the wrong people. We date the same person over and over again. And I don't even mean the same physical person. I mean different people with the same personality, right? We're addicted to this drama of something. We're addicted to pain and chaos. We don't trust ourselves. We don't get intimate with people. We don't really find our authentic self. And when we do that, we don't feel real joy.
I'm laughing because I mean, I've written and spoken not extensively, but quite a bit about my own traumatic experiences and the ways it's shown up. And I can relate to 100% to what you're saying about the
Mhm.
perfectionism, the working, but even the dating the same people. Oh my goodness. In my 20s, there are people I dated literally like 2 or 3 times over the past Like, I think they're like one person I'm thinking of, it took like 7 years for me to finally really understand, no, this is not a good person for you. This is a toxic person, or
Right.
just some of the same personality traits. Like, I definitely had a tendency to date people who had similar toxic traits in common. And it took a while to spot that or to be able
Hmm.
spotting it and doing something about it. Those are two different things. But
So true.
I'm just laughing as you're saying this. I'm like, check, check, check.
Check.
I totally,
Me
yeah.
too. Me
Oh
too.
my goodness. But so like, um, is there I like but because I do want to ask you about just like, what to do when you realize that the trauma is affecting you. But is there anything else before because I had just cut you off there. Like anything else that you want to add about how that trauma can impact someone's daily life? I know we've been talking about friendships and relationships, but is there anything, anything else?
I would say a big one too that is so important is that it makes you afraid to follow or run down your dream. For me, that was so true. I always wanted to be a writer and a communicator and a teacher of sorts. And I didn't have the self-confidence and the belief in myself to do that because of the childhood trauma I endured. And so I took another path, and it was a path that sure seemed to the outside world like I had it all together, but internally, my internal landscape was like I was settling all the time because it wasn't really what I wanted to do. It wasn't really who I wanted to be. So I'm convinced that these stories we have of our shame and our unworthiness and our unlovability keep us in a small life where we don't pursue our real dreams.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I've seen that in myself. I see it in my clients. Like it's
Hmm.
getting people I care about in my life. It's tough when you're in that to see it that way.
Hmm.
So if
For sure.
somebody though, they're starting to like kind of put the pieces together and they're like, oh, I think that this unresolved trauma is really affecting me and I need to do something about it. And you're in your book, you have all these incredible tools that you share, but what, just to give a little taste to our listeners, what are maybe some important first steps that somebody can take to actually like take charge of that narrative and move towards healing?
So, this is such an important question because I know firsthand when I started my healing journey how overwhelming it can feel. You don't know where to go, what to do, what to read, what makes sense, and it's scary. So one of the big things I wanted to do when I got to the other side of my healing journey was create a guidebook for people because I think that you really need kind of a roadmap
Yeah,
on what to do. So the first two big things that I say right in the introduction are one, you have to want to be here in this space. There are so many times when you say, I have this thing, I can't get over it. I have this pain, this pattern, I have this thing. I don't follow through with things. I date the same person over and over again. But you have to want to change it. And so, because it's such hard work, you have to be in a space where you say, I'm ready. Like the pain of being in it almost has to be more than the pain of leaving it, right? So you're like, oh, I can't handle the pain and the suffering anymore, so I want to change. The second big thing is really this, and you mentioned this earlier, is this idea of acknowledging what's happening and the awareness around it. You said something like there's a difference between identifying it
yeah,
and doing something about it,
yes.
right? That's a huge difference. And that is such an important part of this is this acknowledging and being really honest about who you are in the space of sadness or depression or anxiety. What is happening for you? What objectively, and we could talk about this for a long time too, but this objective nature of what you went through, the trauma itself, identifying that objectively, and then understanding that your story is the subjective interpretation of what happened to you. It's your brain's idea and your brain spinning a story about who you were because of that experience. So when you want to be in a space of healing, number one, and two, you're finally ready to get really honest and acknowledge what happened and who you think you are because of it, then you're ready to do the real work.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And it's such a great way of looking at it. I remember a big thing for me was when my father was sick with pancreatic cancer. And I remember at that time I was so focused on taking care of him. I noticed it was like a mini vacation from my own PTSD and trauma
Mhm.
response. I was like, huh, I mean, I guess it'll still be waiting there for me on the other side when I finally like this, I mean, we knew it was going to happen, but I remember after he passed, it wasn't like I went right back to old ways. It was like, we can do this. Like we just handled that. We can handle this now. Like we can actually heal what's going on, and we can actually take the steps needed. And like, it's not, I can't go back to the old ways. It was really interesting to see that because I just wasn't sure what was going to happen. But I think also just having that motivator of like, how would I want my dad to look at me living my life? That was a really big thing for me. It was like, he wouldn't want me to play small or be in these toxic relationships. And it was sort of like holding my own well-being to a higher standard than I had allowed myself to before. Not like a higher standard, but more allowing myself to want more. That was a really big thing. And
Yeah.
just kind of looking through someone else's eyes, someone that like someone I knew who loved me, and, kind of being like, well, how would they treat me? It's almost like, would you talk to your best friend the way that you talk to yourself? It's
Mhm.
kind of a different side of that coin, but
That's so beautiful. And I have to say that I have, my mother died of cancer when I was 24. But the real impetus for me healing, going on my healing journey, was when my beloved dog died. And it was this cathartic moment of grieving where I couldn't stop grieving. And I realized, a week or so in, that it wasn't just about Finn, my dog, anymore. It was all these other things. It was like losing him opened the floodgates. And I was able to release all this grief I had about my mother and my father and my lost childhood. And I love so much what you shared, because I think that there is, and the way you shared it, and your perspective on it about how you felt, and what you believed after your father passed. And it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which is, my barn having burned down, I can now see the moon. And
mm,
when you get to a place in your life where you can look at something so sad that happened to you and see a bright light through it, that is a whole different level of healing, and not just even existing, but thriving. And I have no doubt that your father looks at you now with everything you're doing and the way you help people, and is just so incredibly proud. And it's an honor to him to have the view that you have, and to share it the way you share it.
thank you for sharing your story with me. And I know in your book you share. I'm allergic to small talk, so I really appreciate in that your book you're very open about your own experiences. And I know our listeners, you guys, please check out the book. It has just so much incredible story. So please, like you will get a lot out of this. And so thank you for sharing about your experience now, but also just in the book as well, and just the impact that your own experience with trauma has had on your life. And, I was hoping, could you tell our listeners a little bit about, because it's one thing to be going through something ourselves, right? But then we still have to show up in the world and like, often taking care of other people and, showing up in work and in relationships. And would you be willing to tell us a little bit about what it was like going through that, what you were going through, while also working a career where you were fighting for other people's freedom?
Yes. There's so much about parenthood and motherhood that people don't fully always appreciate, what the energy and time and dedication that goes into that. But just to rewind it a little bit to give some perspective on who I was at the time that I was, learning how to practice law. I had a traumatic childhood. My father went to prison when I was young. He started having legal issues when I was about 11, and he went to the federal penitentiary, and he left me. I was the oldest child. At the time, I had two younger siblings, and my mother had mental health issues, really severe anxiety, depression, probably some manic episodes. She wasn't diagnosed at that time, but looking back on it and knowing what I know now, that's what I would say. Um, and so I was really left to take care of her and my younger brother and sister, and we would go without, we didn't have money. We would have periods of really abject poverty. We would go without food and electricity, and I would ask strangers for money. And when I was 14, my mother had my youngest brother, Brandon. And when she died so young. She was only 44, and I was 24, and I was starting to practice law. And actually, I was still finishing law school at the time. And I adopted my then 9-year-old brother. We had different fathers. He had nobody to take care of him. I had always been his second parent. I loved him. I knew from the minute I saw him in the nursery at the hospital that he and I were meant to be connected forever in a way that was even more than just brother and sister. So I happily started raising him and taking care of him. But I will say that at 24 years old, I didn't really know what that was going to entail. And it was really challenging. And it was truly the most difficult thing I've ever done because it was so much dedication and so much. He was also grieving, right? He was a 9-year-old boy who lost his mother. I did what I could, and I wish I knew then what I know now. I think I would have handled motherhood even more with more grace than I did, but it's the time. And I will say this though, that it was the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And it was my chance to be a mother. And so it was such a beautiful experience. And he and I still have a very special relationship.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that with our
Mhm.
listeners.
Of course.
And just, how did you find as you were, because as you shared, like, it was a really, really difficult experience while also being very rewarding. Were you finding that, you know, like, how did that, when you were kind of trying to go about your day-to-day work and life, did you find that there were things that were challenging for you or things that you did to kind of help yourself get through those challenging moments? Anything that you'd want to share about that?
The challenging moments were that I'm sure so many parents out there can relate to this, that I never felt like I was in the right place at the right time. Or when I was at work, I felt like I should have been at basketball practice with him, or the number of times I was late picking him up because I had to run from something else I was doing. And so those are very challenging times. And you never feel like emotionally that you are doing enough for anybody in your life. And I will say that at that point in my life was before I really had any true understanding of the trauma. I was still so deep in survival mode. I hadn't processed any of what had happened to me. I just kept going on from education, thinking that that was going to heal me somehow. And then my mother died, and I didn't have time to process that because I had to, take care of a 9-year-old boy who was lost his mother. And I didn't have the tools that I have now. And it was so interesting because it wasn't until a couple of years after my mom died, maybe a year, I went to a therapist for the first time. And I said, I don't know. I'm so overwhelmed. I can't get out of bed. I don't know what's wrong with me. You just need to help me figure out how I can go about my life. And she was the first person to say, "You are an emotional stuffer." I said, "What?" And she said, "Everything you've been through, you have compartmentalized it to survive. And you can't keep doing that your whole life." And I didn't want to hear that from her. I was like, I don't want to do this. And then I had another therapist later on, years after that, tell me the same thing. And that's when I started to realize maybe I am stuffing off my emotions. It took me a while to like get there and get really honest about it. But again, you don't know what you don't know.
And I appreciate you sharing that because we do have to be ready. And here I sound like my mom. Like, she started with smoking cessation was her is continues to be something that people seek her out for. But she always would say you have to want to quit. And I think about that sometimes when there's a behavior that I want to change that is really hard to change. But I think you do have to be ready to do the work. And I know I was in therapy for a very long time. And I remember feeling like actually the day my dad was diagnosed with cancer, they told me I was on my way to break up with her. We had been working together for like 9 years. I
Mm.
was like, I'm not making progress. Something's got to change. I should find a new therapist or take a break from this therapy. It wasn't that they were a bad therapist, but I wasn't in a place where I could show up and be willing to really share what I needed to share. But I got the call on my way to the subway, and I was just like, okay, maybe this is not the right time. Maybe
Not
I
the
should
time.
wait. But after he passed, I did finally feel ready to make that change. And I thought maybe I would, go a few months or a year. I made it like 2 months, and then I had just an emotional rock bottom moment that really scared me. And I had a referral from someone who had a trauma specialist recommendation for me. So I called that person and I was like, I need to change. Like, I'm ready to change my behaviors and start taking better care of myself. And it was so helpful, but I had to be ready, really to show up and say those things and do that work, as opposed to
Yeah.
just, checking something off a box. Cause
Right.
it's possible therapy doesn't always truly fix something. You have to be there.
No. And I love that that you shared that and said that, because that is so true. And that's something that I like to say about myself as well, to give people this safe space to know that it first of all, it's challenging these days to find a therapist, one that might take your insurance,
Yes.
one that has the time. It's like, it's really challenging. And then you get into a therapist office, and so many of us aren't ready to divulge, to be honest, to acknowledge, to say, here's what I want to talk about. And that was my experience. So I would go and I would dance around the periphery, and I'd say,
Yeah.
oh, my job, I'm sad, I don't like my job, or I'm in this relationship and I don't know what I'm doing. But those were all just like the repercussions of my internal unprocessed trauma. So had I been getting real about the real root of it, the original wounds, the original things that happened, those things would have kind of resolved, or I would have had more confidence to figure out the other things. So it's so true. And I also like to tell people that you have to work therapy. Therapy isn't like you show up and you just wait for that person to give you the magic answer.
Right.
When I know, and I still go, and like when I'm ready to go, I have like a list, right? Like
Yeah.
I have worked before, and I've been keeping notes, and I'm like, these are things that I'm having a hard time resolving. And so I think talk therapy is super beneficial. And as you know, in the book, I share a lot of other things I tried and a lot of other modalities, but I think it has a lot of value. But I love what you said. It's so powerful and so true that you have to show up ready to do the work in therapy.
I know for myself, showing up grumbling about the subway and the latest bad date I had had was really not, it was helpful in the moment, but yeah, like,
Yeah.
but it's scary to do the work. And I appreciate so much that in your book you share not just about talk therapy, but some other tools. And I would love for you to share with our listeners, maybe if there are a few things that you personally found especially helpful for, rewriting your own story.
Yes. I early on, my healing started with, talk therapy, meditation, journaling. I still love journaling. Just somehow, just I'm a big believer in kind of this idea of like getting it out, honoring your feelings, feeling your feelings. So that later evolved into other aspects. So I really got a lot out of holotropic breath work early on. I did some hypnotherapy. I did age regression therapy. I did a lot of different types of body work, and I go into the more traditionally accepted modalities like somatic therapy and EMDR, and I explain all of those in the book. But for me, it was a lot of trial and error. And I think too, as you have your healing progression, and it really is a journey, and as you're on that, I think that different things help you at different times. So I'm a big proponent of being open to trying something that feels good to you, and that you feel like you found somebody that you trust in that situation. So I do share a lot of different, and so some of the ones I share in the book I haven't tried, but I mention them because I feel like they're, and all the ones I do mention, I have tried to include ones that have certain amount, like they've been around a certain amount of time, or they have certain amount of studies behind them, or whatnot, because I feel like it is important to have something that has some kind of validity
Oh,
to
absolutely.
it. Yeah.
Now, something that has come up in my work, as a dietitian, health coach, Pilates instructor, who has worked with people who are navigating trauma recovery. So I bring a lot of the lifestyle approaches to help complement the other types of healing modalities that they're utilizing. But something that comes up a lot is how to communicate with their employer or with others in their life about what they need. Because sometimes, as you know, like when you're on that healing journey, there are things that come up, or I know something I have found for myself is that I have to be very thoughtful about like my environment and like you know, especially at different times where there have been more challenging times in that journey. It's like just feeling less productive or less focused, or and it can show up in so many different ways for us. But I'm curious to hear if you have anything that you might share with someone about how they might, either something that you wish employers would do to support employees who are recovering from trauma, or things that people should be asking for from people in their life in terms of things that they need to better heal. I don't know, I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts about that.
I find that in my healing journey that I was better suited and had a better clip during my recovery when I could be honest about how I was feeling and what I needed. And that's challenging for people who experience trauma because this majority of the time, it feels as though we don't want to talk about it because there's a certain amount of shame around it, or there's a certain amount of, I don't want everybody to know this happened to me. And so, this idea of creating your own self awareness and then creating a safe space in which you can talk about it. I am a big proponent of having this trauma awareness in a workplace, and of course, about supporting the employees. I will also say, from my perspective, I think that there should also definitely be some real mental health awareness and training for supervisors, C-suite. There are people in my experience who come to work full of their own trauma and creating toxic environments for people, creating triggers around other people's trauma. It's this idea of like taking responsibility as a leader for your emotional and mental health and understanding what energy you're bringing into a workplace. So, I do, of course, support this whole entire idea of trauma awareness around employees. But I think there's also something to be said about the entire organization from the top down. There's this whole multi-generational transfer of trauma, right? In your family, this whole concept of this, where you could have it like your grandmother experienced trauma and then it's unprocessed and unresolved. And that energy gets transferred to your mother and then to you. And it's a real thing. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't that kind of the same thing at work? Like this multi-level transfer of trauma. You get people who come in there who are supervisors, who are, VPs and all these types of positions, and they are bringing in their own trauma and their own, like we talked about, like how does that play out? Well, they come to work. Are they perfectionist? Are they demanding? Are they impatient? Are they creating a toxic work environment? So I want to create an awareness around the space of everybody in a workplace has a responsibility to understand their role and what mental and emotional energy they're bringing into the workplace.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that is so important and not something that gets enough attention. So I really appreciate you highlighting that, because it's something I've seen in my own professional life. It's something my clients have shared with me about, whether it's in their workplace or someone, a friend or a family member it's hard to watch. But I think taking responsibility and, or not, well, I think that there is something to be said for taking responsibility of your own healing with the
Mm-hmm.
intention of healing yourself, but helping foster, a healthy environment around you, whether it's
Yeah.
workplace, family life. It's so important and not talked about
Friends.
enough.
Right. And it's what else is interesting. I read last week there was a study from a couple years ago. The cost of these of lawsuits and claims in the workplace, it cost like $20 billion to corporate America a couple of years ago for all of these kinds of lawsuits. And you'd think, okay, again, like there is this fostering a healthy environment at work. And then there's also this idea of it's costly to not acknowledge the fact that 70% of us are going to experience trauma in our lifetime. It should become part of, right, the health plan that they offer you, because
Yeah.
it's so true. It's like, if and that statistic is the National Council for Mental Well-being. 70% of us are going to experience trauma in our
Yeah.
lifetime. So to me, it's so prevalent, and we really need to have a way that we are addressing it in corporations and organizations for sure.
Something else that I wanted to ask you, as somebody who writes, is writing about these issues, it can, you know, as a fellow writer, like I understand that, at least that my experience, I have had to be very intentional about my self care when writing about things that are, a very like deep topics that I have a connection to. And I'm curious to hear if you have any like self-care essentials that you found helpful for lack of a better phrase, like protecting your energy during that process of, writing and researching these things.
You mentioned earlier that you take a holistic approach to with you and with your clients, and I would say that I do the same. So I on my healing journey, I have found that I had trauma affected me and my stories affected me mind, body, and spirit. So I have, for years been on the, I eat organic, non-GMO, all the things. I love preventative health. So I'm really about, testing. And the last couple of years, I started doing micronutrient testing, which has been such a game changer for me because I realized I had, a gene mutation and I can't process or methylate B vitamins. I got some real B vitamins into my life and I was like, oh my gosh, like physically and mentally, how much better I felt. So I'm big on that. And so I think that there's a lot of physicality to healing and to being good to your body. But I would say that to your point about self-care essentials, when you're writing something like this, when you're healing, when you're journaling, when you're being vulnerable, I'd say the number one thing that I really get the most out of is honoring my emotions. I spent first, more than half of my life, ignoring my feelings and who I was and not honoring them. So it's such a big part of my day to understand, oh, I'm feeling anxious. Oh, that really upset me that somebody said that. And I will step away and I will, even if I just go to say I have to use the bathroom and I go
I can relate to that.
I just honor how I'm feeling about something. And I take a minute and I say, okay. And I have this exercise I do, and it's like part of tapping. I'll either tap my part or I'll tap the side of my hand and I'll say, even though I have all this fear right now, I love and accept myself. And it's this idea of understanding that you're allowed to feel your feelings. You're supposed to feel your feelings. And the Latin word that emotions come from is like amoreve. I might be mispronouncing it, but it means release, move through. You're supposed to feel them and let them flow through you. So I really try to do that because, like I said, I spent so much of my life not doing that and they don't go away. I just saw this funny thing on Instagram the other day and it said, well, 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 if it isn't all the emotions I've been trying to avoid.
Yeah, that's right on. I love that. So I have loved this conversation. I am so grateful that you took time to be with us today and to chat about these topics. If people want to learn more about your work, connect with you, what is the best way for them to do so?
My website is riseabovethestory.com. And on there, there's a free acknowledgement guide that gets you started on your healing journey about that so important step we talked about, right? How to get honest about your trauma and your story. And I'm on social media at Karena Kilcoyne.
And we'll be sure to link to all that stuff in the show notes.
Okay.
So,
Thank you,
Karina,
Jess.
I have one more question for you.
Oh,
This is a question
yeah.
I ask all my guests because I love that there's just so many ways to interpret this. And that question, and I understand changes maybe every day for some of us, but at this moment in time, what does healthy living mean to you?
It means that I have finally tapped into self love. It took me so long to get there, as it does for a lot of people. And I have figured out how to change my negative brain patterns. And like you said, I still do it and I still have moments where I do it, but I am aware enough now to stop myself while I'm doing it and to change the narrative. So, absolutely, for me, it is this deep well of finally just loving myself and feeling very proud about where I came from instead of feeling shame like I did for so long. So, definitely self love.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful interview and having me on your show.
And for all you guys who are out there listening, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you like what you hear, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. They do matter and help me continue to bring you incredible guests like Karina. As always, guys, have a wonderful day, and we'll talk soon. Thank you for listening to Drama Free Healthy Living with Jess Cording. We'll see you next time.